I think we got most everyone here, so we'll get started on this today. Uh, just want to thank everyone for coming today to our discussion on the dark web and the other side of the internet. Uh, as you all know, I'm Ken Chikanovich. I'm the Senior Business Development Coordinator here with Summit, and I'll be moderating today's discussion on the dark web and what it means for your business. Along with that, we'll be providing 6 tips on ways to protect yourself and also why continuous dark web monitoring is so helpful for you. We'll also be taking your questions at the end. So if anything does come up, feel free to pop it into the chat session and we will get those answered at the end of the call if there's time available. To help us with our discussion today, we have Bruce Brossecker. He is a senior security consultant with Summit Business Technologies, specializing in compliance. Bruce has worked in the IT industry for 30 years. 20 of those were in the public sector. Bruce spends his time consulting with companies on varying levels of compliance through assessments and remediation. Just as a reminder, as a thank you for attending today's webinar, we will be providing a one-time dark web scan of your domain, and we'll be reviewing it with you personally and explaining the findings from that scan. So Bruce, to help everyone out here and bring everyone up to speed, what exactly is the dark web?
Well, thank you, Ken, and good afternoon, everyone. Just to put things in context, I want to talk a little bit about the internet in general and where the dark web and the deep web fit into that. I tend to think of the internet much like an iceberg. You've all heard the adage that you only see the tip of the iceberg above the surface of the water. And that's true of the internet as well. The tip of the iceberg is the surface or open web, which is the type of things that you typically do on a day-to-day basis. Your Google, Yahoo, Bing web searches, your e-commerce through Amazon, eBay, Walmart, Target, Office Depot, and the like, as well as your social media sites that you go to on a day-to-day basis, and your regular web browsing where you open your typical web browser and enter a website or do a web search and go to a website from that search. That would be the surface web, which you see kind of day to day and above the water. Below that is the deep web, which is still legitimate internet purposes, but they're not typically searchable or reachable through normal day-to-day methods. This is legitimate traffic and legitimate data such as your normal banking information, email content, medical records, things of that like, that again have a legitimate purpose to transverse the internet, but are not as accessible. So that's kind of the middle area. And then below that, you have the dark web. The dark web is more like a private club that requires exclusive membership to access. It's not accessible through normal legitimate means. It's not searchable or indexable in a standard fashion. This is the area where information and in some cases physical goods, illegal goods are for sale. It's big business in this area. Most of you are going to be familiar with data breaches that you've seen on the news, or where you've gotten notices that you're getting a year of credit monitoring for things like the Home Depot or Target breach. When people talk about data breaches, the dark web is that area where that information is put up for sale and is shared amongst different entities.
So if it's the bottom of that iceberg, as you talk about with the internet, then it must not really be that big, right? Comparatively to the rest?
Well, it's a little hard to quantify the exact size of the dark web due to the nature of the information that's being shared and transacted on in that area. But we do have some estimates. It's estimated that the surface web or visible web makes up about 4% of the data on the internet. And those same estimates put the amount of data in the dark web at 7,500 terabytes. To put that in context that most people will understand, an average size for a high quality JPEG image file is approximately 2 megabits. So that should give you some context as to the size. And it's also important to note that a lot of the data is text-based data or database information, which is significantly smaller than your average image file. So that also kind of puts in context the volume of data that we're talking about. And then, as mentioned, the business side of the aspect of it, annual revenue by cybercrime was estimated at $1.5 trillion in 2019. So it's significant, to say the least.
Yeah, quite significant. And obviously with 2 million users every day, how are these people accessing it? You mentioned it's not the surface web, so I'm assuming it's not through Google.
Correct. So it's not accessible through standard URLs, which are universal resource locators, which is the web address that you type into your web browser when you want to go somewhere, like www.cnn.com. The typical it's accessed through a specific browser. The most commonly used one is a browser called the Tor browser, Tor standing for the onion router. So occasionally when you're seeing stories about it, they'll mention that. It's not indexed, as we mentioned, by search engines. So you kind of have to know the address that you're going to, again, but it's not a typical URL. And some sites will require proof of criminal activity to access it. If they're transacting in illegal products or data, they want to make sure that the people they're granting access to those exclusive areas are engaged in the same type of activities that they are as well.
So Bruce, you mentioned a few breaches earlier, the Home Depot breach, the Target breach, and these things do hit the news. Also, some of the other items that you see, I'm sure a lot of you have heard of, MGM Resorts, Nintendo, both of those were breached. And then also there have been breaches of COVID tracking databases as well, contact tracing. And then of course, one of the largest breaches of all time was leaked on the dark web, had 3.2 billion records in it that was found. To put that into context, there's only 7 billion people on the planet Earth. So that's basically one piece of information for every 2 people out there. So Bruce, with all these stories in the news and all of this information out there, how are these criminals getting access to these credentials?
So there's a variety of ways in which the criminals will try to access data to exfiltrate it out and make it available on the dark web. This slide talks about several of them. I'm not going to go over each one by one, but I want to talk about a couple of them. Obviously, phishing is one that's in the news a lot. It's a very common way to get credentials. Another one that I want to talk a little bit about is malicious insider. And what that typically means is either a disgruntled current employee or disgruntled former employee that still has some access and exploits that access to get additional information out of a network. Business email compromise is another exploit that gets utilized by these individuals and organizations. What that means is typically your email credential will become compromised, and those individuals will sit and wait within your email system, monitoring ongoing communications that you have that are legitimate. And when the time is right, they will either get data out of that communication, or they'll use their access to your email system to insert themselves into a legitimate business transaction, changing routing numbers or account numbers to get money or other information out of your particular systems.
So you mentioned phishing, and obviously a lot of people hear phishing scams, I think of the Nigerian prince, but a lot of criminals will use a little bit more common and updated information here. Things like, again, coming back to current events, COVID-19, we saw a lot of phishing attempts to where people were utilizing, pretending to be the CDC or pretending to say that they've got information on some of the stimulus checks that came out as well. So, Bruce, with a lot of these credentials, are they just trying to get it inside someone's direct system and network, or what else are they looking for here?
Well, they're looking for a lot of data, but before we move on from phishing, I want to talk also a little bit about the fact that phishing attacks are not limited to just email. Obviously, email is the most common method of getting information out of unsuspecting users, but texting phishing or smishing, SMS phishing, is becoming more and more common, where those individuals and organizations are sending messages to users purporting to be from legitimate sources, like shipping notifications and the like. And you mentioned current events, and obviously COVID was a big one over the last year, but they also take advantage of other current events like natural disasters, looking for donations, holidays, and the like as well. So those are some, other kind of phishing related examples to talk about a little bit. But obviously, as you were mentioning too, email credentials are the most commonly sought after credential, but there are a lot of other credentials that people tend to forget about in regards to what their users or employees have access to. And again, typically, individuals will use the same user ID, which is often their email address, and reuse that same user ID and password, unfortunately, across multiple platforms relating to their business accounts and the like. A good example from this slide is ADP. How many companies on this call or companies are you familiar with that are using ADP for their processing? Additionally, e-commerce sites like Staple and Office Depot are commonly used. And because of what I just mentioned about the fact that the user accounts are often the same between these different services, and again, unfortunately, the passwords are as well. If one of these credentials is compromised, and that's the case, then they have access to additional accounts to try to get more information out of by having that information.
So we talked a lot about email and credentials here, and also ways to get into some other services. But is it just email and credentials that these people are transacting on the dark web? What else is available on there in terms of information?
Sure, there's a variety of information that's available on the dark web or through these breaches. For example, a lot of financial institutions require proof of identity before allowing you to set up an account with them to verify you are who you say they are, which often requires submitting a picture of a photo ID, sometimes by itself and sometimes with you holding the ID in addition to it. So depending on the organization that's breached, they may actually get more than just your username and password. They may get your actual identity information up to and including your date of birth and identifying information, whether it's your driver's license number, your passport number, and the like, that was part of that information that was submitted for verification of identity. And or your social security number would be another type of personally identifiable information that's out there. In that same vein, obviously, banking information is transacted on a lot, no pun intended. That can be business bank account information, whether it's bank account numbers and routing information to be used for ACH fraud, or the more traditional, which is talked about more often, credit card information, your credit card number, expiration date, and CCV number from the back would also be some of the financial information that's available out there. One thing to keep in mind, as we mentioned earlier, is that the dark web truly is big business. A lot of times when a hacker or organization gains access to a credential, they're not looking to sell that individual credential or to use that individual credential as part of a dark web transaction. They're looking to use it to get into a network or into a system and get a larger volume of information out of there and package that larger volume of information and then resell that on the dark web. So typically they're trying to get a large quantity of credit card numbers or a large quantity of identification information and then packaging that up and selling that. So there really are two types of transactions, for lack of a better word. There's the data breach where the package of data is removed from a system, and then there's the sale of that package of data on the dark web for a relatively small amount of money. The example on the screen here, shows that they're being sold for $10, and they're really handled like a commodity. The sellers are rated much like they would be on an e-commerce site, and then once that data is purchased, that data package is purchased, then that data is used for larger transactions with a higher monetary value. If it's ACH data, they may deposit a small amount of money, a few dollars, into an account to make sure that the routing information is correct, and then turn around and make a large withdrawal. Or they may use the credit card information to do purchases and cash advances, but by buying a large package of it, they reduce the risk that the data has been reported as compromised. So even if you're talking about 1,000 credit card numbers and 10% of them have been reported as stolen, then they still have the 90% available to exploit.
Got it. So we talk about the markets, what's on the dark web, and how they're getting in. It's obviously a lot of scary information, but Bruce, are there things that people can do today to protect themselves from these criminals?
Sure, there's definitely methods that can be utilized today to help protect their own credentials and their own users' credentials by sharing this information with them. We're going to share 6 tips with you on that. First and foremost is practice good password hygiene. And what that really means is routinely changing your passwords. Most users tend to not change their password unless forced to do so, whether it's on your business network where you have a policy that says they have to change every 90 days, or a website or account site has that type of policy in place, or if there was a breach and they're forced to do so. Another way to maintain good password hygiene is to utilize unique passwords for each account. Don't use the same password over and over again. That way, if something is compromised, it limits the accounts that are compromised as well. You should ensure that your passwords are complex. They should contain a mix of upper and lowercase letters, numbers, and symbols. A good way to do that is to use a simple replacement where you're replacing letters with numbers or numbers with letters. For example, replacing an E with a 3 or an A with a 4 is a good example of a replacement strategy. And then you should refrain from using easily guessed words or phrases or easily sourced information for your passwords. And that would include things like birthdays in your family, significant others' names, children's names, because these individuals that are trying to gain access to credentials will often scour social media to get clues. And if you're posting things like, I'm out celebrating my 10th anniversary tonight, then they'll know a date. Or, if you're tagging someone in a photo, your children or significant other, then they'll get a name. So those are some of the things that would revolve around good password hygiene. Another way to protect your credentials is using multi-factor authentication, which is generally receiving a text message to your smartphone with a code, or utilizing an app on your phone that receives a code or a push message to allow you to log on in addition to your username and password by an additional piece of information. Without that smartphone, even if they get the username and password, they won't have access to everything that's necessary to log in. you shouldn't post your publicly on your website uh, email addresses that are live within your organization. Often, again, these organizations and individuals will scour email addresses, and if you're posting an email address on your website, they know it's a legitimate email address, which, if that's being utilized as a username, is again half of the keys necessary to get in. In that same vein, try not to use an email address as a user ID. Not every site or service will allow you to not do that, but if there is the option to not use your email address, try to use a different account name for the user ID, and don't reuse the same user ID, much like don't use the same password over and over again. We also recommend implementing security awareness training and phishing simulations. An organization's users are their last line of defense against people trying to get into a network or organization. I often liken this to spending a lot of money on a alarm system and really good lock for your business, which becomes useless if somebody inside that building opens the door for individuals to get in. So security awareness training and phishing simulations kind of train those users to be more aware and think before they act. And then obviously we recommend continuously monitored dark web scanning. In many ways, it's comparable to LifeLock that individuals have, but for their business. So it's similar in that regard as well.
Sure. So to kind of continue on that fact here of the continuous dark web monitoring, as a thank you day, we're going to be doing a one-time scan. So what's the difference between just a one-time and continuous dark web monitoring, and what are the benefits of it?
Sure. So, a one-time scan is exactly that. It's a slice in time. When we run the single scan, it's going to go out and look at the dark web and find any credentials that it can based on what's out there at that moment in time. As we mentioned earlier, you see the breaches in the news frequently, so they're continually happening. So it's an evolving landscape. It's an evolving amount of information that's out there. The continuous monitoring is 24/7, 364 days a year, constantly looking at anything that shows up on there. So as new breaches occur and new data is available, it's being referenced against that to see if any of your credentials are out there. And what that does is it alerts us, and in turn will alert you that a credential has been compromised, which allows you to get ahead of the game, so to speak, so you can make a change to that credential before it's potentially utilized in a nefarious fashion. At Summit, we've partnered with a company called ID Agent to provide our dark web monitoring, and they're recognized as both an industry leader in the field, and we're a pioneer in the field of dark web monitoring as well.
Fantastic. Well, Bruce, thank you for all of this. Really appreciate it. And obviously, if you have any questions or would like some additional information, feel free to enter it into the chat here, and we'll be happy to answer those questions for you. And any questions we don't get to today, we'll reply back to you. Or if something comes up afterwards, feel free to email us at sales@summitbiztech.com, and we can field those questions later on. As a reminder, we are going to be doing a one-time dark web scan, and we'll be reaching out to you in the next week to schedule a call to go over the findings of that dark web scan with you. And then also we'll be disseminating the presentation and webinar, making that available. Feel free to share that among your colleagues at your place of business, and they might actually come up with some questions as well. So Bruce, we do have a couple questions coming in today.
Sure.
So first one, you mentioned that the dark web is like an exclusive club. How are people getting access to it? I'm assuming there's a bouncer that you have to get past.
Well, there are a couple different ways that they can gain access to. As I mentioned, there's some specific tools like the onion router that are used to access some of the areas. And then much like a chat board or things like that, you you apply for access, for lack of a better word, and then there's a gatekeeping. So there could be some proof of criminal activity, like I mentioned. It kind of varies depending on specifically what you're looking for on the dark web. It's not just data that's being transacted out there. There's actual criminal activity that occurs other than the sale of data. There's the sale of illicit material, trading of illicit material, images, and the like that also occur out there. It's kind of it kind of varies depending on the nature of what you're looking for in that regard.
Fantastic. So, one of the big things obviously everyone saw in the news just recently was the ransomware attack on the Colonial pipeline. How does this relate to ransomware attacks?
Well, a ransomware attack, it's relatable in the sense that they both often use some of the same techniques to get into the system, but ransomware by its very nature is locking access to your data and having you pay to get access back to it in that regard, where from a data breach standpoint, where they're getting a large quantity of data, packaging it, and selling it on the dark web, in many cases, you may not even know that they've been there, or may not know it when it occurs, because they're going in, they're looking around, and they're trying to get that data out, and then packaging it up and reselling it. Ransomware, that they're there, they're asking. They're asking for you to pay a ransom to gain access to your own data back. Now, that also doesn't mean that they're, in addition to ransomwaring you, that they didn't exfiltrate data before they did that. So, so they could be doing both. So they can be related in that regard.
So obviously we've talked about a couple big companies: MGM, Marriott, Target, Home Depot, Nintendo. I mean, those are big corporations. For the folks on the call here today, they're mostly small businesses. Why would someone on the dark web, criminal, be looking at them specifically?
So, well, they may not be looking for them specifically, but what could happen is a larger organization that the small business does business with, like a Office Depot or Home Depot or whatever, that gets breached, that has that information on that small business in their system that gets breached, and then their data is shared that way. And if their data is in there, they can use that data to make a transaction, so to speak. So if your account information as a small business is included in the breach, then they would do that. Now, they conversely look at small businesses as easy pickings, because in some cases they don't have the resources to throw at the problem of protection like their big brethren do, and they can utilize that as a method to get into a certain system, a larger system, work their way up the chain, so to speak, because those sites have access to them as well.
All right. So with it being out there, and obviously people can get access to the Onion browser and things like that, why doesn't the government just go in there and pull the plug and shut it down and start arresting people? I mean, it's a bunch of criminals, right?
So the governments, plural, in the world do periodically try to go out and tamp down the efforts, but due to the very nature of where the data is, and there are protections that users use to mask what they're doing. So you don't always see what is the data that's moving across the internet. It's wrapped in a wrapper, so to speak, and passed along. So you don't necessarily know that that data is coming from the dark web, or that data is nefarious and being transacted that way. So they're hiding what they're doing in plain sight. So it's a little difficult for governments to always shut something down. There are some rather famous examples of sometimes the government gets it right and is able to do that. An example being the Pirate Bay, where torrents are transacted, has been shut down numerous times and continues to move around, and they stomp it down. And then a site called the Silk Road, which was basically eBay for criminals, was shut down. On that same vein, though, I would want to mention one last thing before we wrap up. I know we're getting close to 3. It's not a good idea to try to access the dark web. So just because you're hearing some of these terms like the Onion browser and those kind of sites and things like that, it's not a good idea to go out looking for those sites or that data. You probably shouldn't, not probably, you shouldn't go looking into the dark corners of the web.
Got to stay out of the seedy parts of the city, right?
Stay out of the seedy parts of town. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, fair enough. All right. Well, obviously, it's 3 o'clock here, so I don't want to be running us too long. We do have a few other questions available. I apologize. We were not able to get to them, but we will go ahead and respond back to you with that information. And also, like I said, we'll be reaching out to you to schedule a call to go over your one-time dark web scan. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining today. Really appreciate everything that you've done, you all being here, and hope you learned a little bit today. So thank you very much and have a great rest of your afternoon.